Hi, everybody. Today, I want to present to you this new reading on Tariq Ali's Islam Quintet. As you can see, the title of the presentation is The Multiple Dimensions of Tariq Ali's Pomegranate Tree and its Four Offshoots, a new perspective on Tariq Ali's Islam Quintet. I decided to write this specific title because my study starts with the first novel of this interesting collection, but my study in one way or another links this first novel with the later four novels as well. By the way, I started working on this topic in 2019. I spent a lot of time bringing a new perspective on to this collection of novels because my dream was to make this topic the focus of my PhD thesis in English literature and cultural studies. However, for some reasons, I wasn't able to start my PhD in this field, so I thought of sharing what I found with you. I think that this topic is significant in terms of the power of symbols in the narrative, which have their own impact on the story, whether the author was aware of them or not. At any rate, according to what we are told by Tariq Ali himself regarding the first novel of the series, that is Shadows of the Pomegranate Tree, when Edward Said read it, he liked it and encouraged the author to write the complete series, saying, quote, "Don't stop now, tell the whole bloody story," unquote. As you can see, the Islam Quintet comprises of 5 novels written between 1992 and 2010. The narrative of this collection focuses on Islamic civilization's interactions with Europe across different time periods and different settings. These 5 historical and political novels explore themes of religious tolerance, conflict, and coexistence, spanning from Moorish Spain to the modern Middle East. In other words, they mainly depict the clash between the East and the West in different times and areas. For example, the setting of Shadows of the Pomegranate Tree is in Andalusia. During the last decade of the 15th century, that's to say, a few years after the famous downfall of Granada as a result of Ferdinand and Isabella's hostile policy against Muslims and other minorities. The second novel, the Book of Saladin, takes place in different areas of the 12th century Arabia, Cairo, Damascus, and Palestine. And it narrates Salahuddin's glorious accomplishment. While the setting of the third novel, The Stone Woman, in the Ottoman Empire, is in the Ottoman Empire, namely the capital, Istanbul, at the end of the 19th century. The fourth novel, A Sultan in Palermo, is mostly in Sicily, approximately at the middle of the 12th century. However, the events of the final book of the quintet, Night of the Golden Butterfly, interestingly happened just around the beginning of the third millennium, and mostly in London, Lahore, Paris, and Beijing. All these novels, and in a less mild manner for the second one, somehow deal with the way Muslims were persecuted or how they lost their sovereignty in Andalusia, Jerusalem, Sicily, the Ottoman Empire, and even in China. That is, they tackle many past losses and mistakes whose fruit, more or less, is the situation of Muslims that we still see in our modern world. Therefore, most of the studies, if not all, made by far about these novels have employed a kind of political or power-based analysis. I tried to read everything I was able to find about these novels. The types of analysis that I found were very political, such as secularist, Marxist, deconstructionist, utopian, feminist, anti-Orientalist, peripheral literature analysis, post-colonial, historiographic metafiction, the self and the other narrative, anti-neoliberal, criticizing the new colonial Western agenda, anti-imperial reading, challenging Eurocentric perspective, cross-culturality and multiculturality, ideological criticism, critical discourse analysis, religions or civilizations clash, and so on. As you can see in this slide, are some examples of these interesting studies that I refer to. In short, most, or if not all, the aforementioned studies were made based on the main theme of this quantity. But as far as I am concerned, what nobody has particularly studied so far is the symbolism of the tree that appears repeatedly in the entire five novels. After all, the very first one even has the word tree in its very title, which implies the importance of this entity uh, for the author or in these novels. So it is not surprising that the tree, being the signature of the Arabic civilization in the Spanish Peninsula, becomes very dominant in the novel. And by the same token, tree, of course, has very important significance to all Muslims, and of course, even to non-Muslims as well. Providing a historical background about the issue of trees could be fruitful. The importance of trees is noticed in the area a long time, even before Islam. For example, the Mesopotamian history, so to speak, started with a search for trees. The major adventure of the Epic of Gilgamesh launched when Gilgamesh and Enkidu traveled to the cedar forest in order to cut the spell-binding trees. Likewise, in the pagan era before Islam, Arabs paid a considerable attention toward trees, which was poetically expressed in their poetry. They were even obsessed with pedigree. That's to say, they developed a unique science to trace back one's lineage. They even searched for the family tree of their friends and in-laws while deciding to create the ties of friendship or partnership. However, with the emergence of Islam, the importance of trees gained further significance. The Quran is full of many references regarding trees being miracles of God as well as having very important characteristics. The next Quranic verse is enough as an example for that. Quote, in them, both the earthly and heavenly paradise will be fruits and date palms and pomegranates, unquote. Likewise, to provide real historical examples about the importance of trees for Muslims of Andalusia, we can remember that the 8th century Andalusian ruler Abdul Rahman the first even wrote poems about the beauty of palm trees, which connected him with his origin. According to another historical report narrated by Maqarri at-Tilmisani in his famous book about Andalusia, when the Muslim caliph was forced to demolish a house with a palm tree in its courtyard owned by a Muslim woman in order to expand the mosque in Cordoba. The owner of the house refused to sell her house unless she was given a house with a palm tree in its place. Um, then the man in charge ordered that a house with a palm tree be purchased for her, even if it cost all the money in the treasury. And then this woman's house was added to the boundaries of the mosque. What is worth noting in this incident is that the woman insisted on getting a house with a palm tree instead of insisting that the new house would be near to a mosque like her old one. This indicates the spiritual importance of the tree in the mentality or in the mindset of the Muslims of Andalusia. Furthermore, in Ibn al-Wardi's beautiful description of Cordoba, he mentioned that the courtyard of the Great Mosque of Cordoba was always full of orange and pomegranate trees for the poor to eat from. Similarly, the tree was very important for the Ottomans because their empire started with a dream by the founder father Othman, who saw in his dream a giant tree which will rule the world, that is, of his future generations. We even have a Sufi book about the Ottoman tree in which the author apparently predicted the rise of the Ottoman Empire. Hence, the Chinar tree represents something very special to the Ottomans. So it held great significance in the Ottoman Empire for both symbolic and practical reasons. It is a symbol of strength and longevity. It is also connected to rulers because several Ottoman sultans associate themselves with the Chinar tree. The tree also has cultural, and religious significance, symbolizing wisdom to the Ottomans. Thus, the Chinar tree embodied both the power and the spiritual identity of the Ottomans, becoming an enduring emblem of the empire. In fact, to further dwell on this important symbol among Muslims would distract the main goal of the presentation, which is to look at this symbol as it was depicted in Ali's Quantity of Islam. Hence, this presentation will trace back the development as well as the impact of this specific symbol along all the narration. It seems that the role of the tree as a symbolic entity is changed in every novel in accordance with the setting and society in which the events of the novel take place. Tree being rich in the symbolic meanings was employed differently to cope perfectly with each novel's main theme. Thus, each novel will be examined separately. In doing so, this presentation will draw a new conclusion about the Islam Quintet. My hypothesis, briefly stated, is as follows. I will show how and why the symbolism of the tree in shadows of the pomegranate tree was often linked to history, while it was linked with power in the Book of Saladin. Then, in the third novel, The Stone Woman, the symbolism of the tree was often associated with melancholy. In A Sultan in Palermo, it was linked to history, while in The Night of the Golden Butterfly, the symbolism of the tree was linked with order and chaos. The first novel, Shadows of the Pomegranate Tree, narrates the story of some Moorish family during the critical times of the Spanish Reconquista, which ended with the Christian completely kicking out the Muslims and Jews and other minorities out of Andalusia. The title of the novel, as Kanita Abedpur noticed, quote, refers to a clump of trees in the family's courtyard, but also emerges as the symbol of Muslim civilizational heritage, which transformed Andalusia into a garden and made it a fertile region thanks to Arab irrigation method, unquote. Um, Hence, references to trees are recurrent in different parts of the novel. Even agricultural figures of speech were employed along the narration in order to give a sense of natural surroundings. Next to that, a stress on lineage to one's origin that surpasses the invader's power is also asserted. In this sense, Tariq Ali employed the symbol of a tree to its full extent. At the beginning of the novel, and even before we arrive to the very first page of the novel, we are provided with a sketch of the family tree, with the roots of some of the former generations, as well as the siblings of the Muslim protagonists, the Banu Hudayl family. No wonder that the relation to one's soil, blood, and culture becomes rather dominant in the novel. In this novel, the symbolism of the tree is so rich and it basically serves highlighting the connection between man and his land. A tree as a symbol doesn't only represent the unity for all its branches, but it also relates with the departed by its very roots, which are firmed in the soil. That is, the roots reach out to the ancestral bodies, and from them, a tree takes its nutrition, so to speak. In fact, in this novel, the tree, um, whose significance changes somewhat before and after the Reconquista, represent the positive side of history, encompassing knowledge, beauty, and happiness when it appears in a context related to the old days. However, it represents the opposite when it appears in a context involving the impact of the Reconquista. However, the prologue of the novel starts with the infamous event of destroying the Arabic books which were previously hunted from Cornata's libraries by the men of the Inquisition. We are even told how Muslims tragically watched the burning of the growing palisade of books, causing a kind of nightmare which pointed towards the near erasure of the Islamic culture in the era. Books being the very cornerstone of every civilization are the very core of people's identity. Consequently, this scene was given a focal point along the entire narrative, showing that books are the source of one's very existence. Moreover, the act of burning books itself symbolically refers to the destruction of trees, since there are multiple connections between books and trees. Generally speaking, books are made out of trees. Furthermore, this connection between trees and books is indicated even linguistically, in that they both have leaves. So, the seemingly destruction of the Arabic books was also metaphorically the destruction of their trees, and vice versa. By the way, I used an EPUB version of these novels, except for one. And as you know, there are no page numbers in the EPUB versions. This is why in the references I have included the chapter numbers instead of the page numbers, as you can see. Uh, in a natural description, we are told how the Hudayls cultivated the land and planted orchards, and how these orchards were full with various trees of vineyards, almond, orange, pomegranate, that gave the appearance of children glustering about their mother. The novel emphasizes that the Hudayls respect their land to the point that they considered anyone who changed their land-based job to be a traitor. As a side note, I will try my best to specify the scope of my study on the references to trees and not burden you with the details and names of all the characters, as we have five novels full of events and persons. However, in the opening scene, after the prologue, we see the child of the Moorish family asking the worried old servant about the person she was talking to. She answered the child with a response that foreshadowed a future event. I was talking to the shadows of the pomegranate tree, at least of the pomegranate trees. At least they will be here when we are all gone. The practical importance of trees is reoccurring in the novel. For example, Zahra, the Hudayls member who was kept for years in a mental house, talked about her days in the Maristan hospital. She said, quote, I carved many figures in wood to keep myself from really going mad, unquote. So the therapeutic as well as aesthetic benefit of trees are stressed here. In another scene, we are introduced to a person who refused the bad execution of Muslims. This man was the Count Don Inigo, who warned Cisneros that Muslims should not be treated with violence. He said, they are not ruthless phenomenon. They cannot be wiped out with a lash of the whip. They will resist. During these heated and tense times, Omar, the head of the Hudayls, as well as protagonist of the novel, paid a visit to his one childhood friend, but now the Captain General of Granada, Count Don Inigo, blaming him for allowing the big fireworks of the Arabic books to happen. The direct connection between books and trees become obvious in Omar's angry sentence. Your church put an axe to a tree that afforded free shade for all. As I said earlier, I will jump directly from one tree reference to another without going into details. The story of the destruction of books was so central in holding the threads of different events in the novel. For example, later we are introduced to a young student coming from Egypt to do some historical research on the life of his great grandfather, Ibn Khaldun, the famous scientist and historian. Ironically, he arrived at the same day when the books of the Granada's libraries were burned. Describing his bitter feelings to his friends after seeing the mountain of books ablaze, he said, "Everything we had planted lay withered and dead." Um, Metaphors of trees decorated most parts of the narrative. When Omar heard about his frivolous son's secret plan to fight the enemies, he tried to convince him that fighting under such circumstances would be way more dangerous than his young, thoughtless son ever realized. He said, "It is far easier to drink poison underneath a tree by the river and die peacefully, but better still to live, my son." And in one part of his reply, the son said angrily, "Sooner or later they must reach Al Hudail. They want to reduce Al Andalus to a desert. They want to burn our memory." No need to highlight that the importance of trees exists in their sentences. On the one hand, for the father to wait for the enemy to come or even to commit suicide under a tree would be more logical act than what his son was planning to do. On the other hand, for the son, it is a matter of time before the enemy would come and destroy everything, including the trees from which his father draws consolation. Having convinced his father that he must fight, he went out with a sword in hand, coming across his great uncle, who already took the enemy's side, and his great aunt, who recently got out of the Maristan. The next description of these two old figures was bleak, that even the metaphor of tree seemed to get deformed, so to speak. Um, they were described as follows: remnant of a generation which had ceased to exist. They resembled a pair of stunted, weather-beaten pine trees. As I mentioned before, the symbolism of the tree was positively connected to a beautiful history. However, after the catastrophe, they become deformed. For example, the description to the beaten pine trees is quite different from the past days. For instance, when Zahra heard about her young siblings' Hind's intimate secret meetings with her lover in the pomegranate grove, the old memories took her far away to a beautiful past that she asked dreamingly. The clump of trees just before the house is the visible when is visible when you are returning from the village. When you lie flat on the ground, does it still feel as if one is underneath a tent of pomegranates with a round window at the top? And when you open your eyes and look through it, Do the stars still dance in the sky? So the imagery of trees reflected the individual state of mind as well as the societal background. Whenever we go back to the past event, tree image seemed so beautiful, and vice versa. At any rate, Zahra, whose name means flower, was the first character to die in the novel, which implies the death and deformation of the native natural images when things start to fall down. She died as a result of the memory of her unfulfilled love. She was buried near to her mother, who, quote, lay buried underneath a palm tree, unquote. Um, However, another meaningful, relevant usage of a tree is found elsewhere. When Zuhair, a member of Hudayl family, narrated an old story to his old teacher, Al-Zindiq, reminding him about the day in which they became close friends. He reminded him about some past occurrence that took place in Al-Hudayl when Al-Zindiq was 60 years old and he passed by three boys perched on a branch near the top of a tree. They shouted some insult to the old man, thinking that he would ignore the remark and walk away. But instead, to the great amazement of the boys, he clambered straight up the tree and took them by surprise. Being remembered of that day, Zindiq remarked as follows: I climbed the tree precisely to teach you that nothing should ever be taken for granted. So most of the past stories included three references. In this manner, tree appeared from time to time in the narrative to provide a sense of nostalgic beauty against the present ugly reality. In other words, the trees of the past were associated with beauty, happiness, and learning. Another nostalgic description where the tree is portrayed as a shield against the ugliness of the present, so to speak, occurs when two characters reminisce about the beautiful days of the past. I used I used to dream about this courtyard every month. Remember the shadows of the pomegranate tree during the full moon, Amira. Remember what we used to say? If the moon is with us, what need do we have for the stars? However, in the final appearance of trees in the novel, we see them in the middle of destruction following the final devastation of the Hudayl family. In fact, the final scene of the novel is so heartbreaking, with the village of Al Hudayl destroyed and its inhabitant brutally murdered. But shortly before that occurred, the family's cook, also known as the dwarf, took Yazid, the youngest of the family, and went to a hiding place described as follows: toward the former garden, beyond it, just below the wall, there was a cluster of trees and plants of every variety. They stayed there for some time until the child wasn't able to wait and hide anymore. Thus, he went out against the dwarf's attempts to stop him. In doing so, the child was killed to join the rest who were also slaughtered. So unlike in the past days when trees appeared in positive contexts, here after the total destruction, we see them in a context filled with death. At any rate, when the dwarf came out from his hiding place, he saw that everything was destroyed. It was later when the frivolous Zuhair came back to the village that he saw the terrible aftermath. Zuhair and the dwarf were the only surviving individual who remained after this great massacre of the Hudayl. Zuhair asked the dwarf to travel to his sister who lived in Morocco with her husband, the intellectual Ibn Dawood. In the letter, that he enclosed with the dwarf. He explained to his sister what had happened to their family. He wrote that he had also sent, quote, all the papers of our old Zandiq, look after them well and let me know what Ibn Dawood thinks of their contents, unquote. This idea seems to emphasize the importance of seeking knowledge as well as understanding one's history, regardless of how terrible the circumstances may be. Um, Before moving to the next novel and before leaving Andalusia, I just want to highlight that various agricultural figures of speech, so to speak, were employed in this novel, which support my hypothesis. To prove some examples, Yazid's love for his sister was so deep-rooted. Um, Elsewhere, we are told about the Crusaders' desire to plant another culture in Al-Andalus. Um, Al-Zindiq told Zuhair, it was said the seed which produced me was planted by Ibn Farid, his grandfather. Sexual organs were assimilated to fruits and trees, which I will not mention. Um, in short, next to these relevant figures of speech, in the shadow of pomegranate tree, the symbolism of the tree functioned on various vital levels. Even though it was very positive when it was employed to refer to the beautiful past, it was clearly deformed after the destruction of the inhabitants' homeland. We have, as we have seen, the symbolic implications of the tree in the first novel were employed in a way to link the inhabitants with their land, yet their symbol meaning was changed in accordance with the movement between past and present in the presence. In other words, when three references appeared about past event, they were often connected to freedom, peace, happiness, but their meaning gradually started to be negative after the political and cultural changes that took place. Thus, such adaptation of the tree in the first novel is understandable since the novel explores the downfall of Muslims in specific time and place. However, the second novel deals with quite different events. That's to say, it deals with the Muslims' rise and victory. Therefore, we will see that the tree imagery or symbolism always expresses power in this novel, or at least the tree is always portrayed in a context that is associated with power. It must be said that the idea of keeping the connection with the past is also stressed in the Book of Salahuddin. However, the Book of Salahuddin opens on a cold winter night of 1180 Cairo in the house of the narrator Ibn Yaqub, who soon will become the Sultan's trusted scribe. In the opening scene, Ibn Yaqub was sitting at the house of his friend, the famous physician and philosopher Maimunide, or Ibn Maymun, who was forced to flee Andalusia because of the Christian intolerance toward Jews and Muslims at that time. During their friendly chat, Salahuddin unexpectedly visited the place, asking Maimonides about a good scribe to write down his biography, where he told Salahuddin that Ibn Yaqub is the most reliable scholar regarding this issue. And from here, we start to know about the personality of Salahuddin based on what he mentioned to the scribe on daily basis and based on what the scribe himself witnessed. And in many other areas, we hear stories about Salahuddin's childhood narrated by those people around him. For example, Shadi, an old guardian and educator of Salahuddin, was the source of some old stories about the Sultan or about the future Sultan. And in this context, Shadi narrated about his maternal grandfather is worth quoting. Uh, so his grandfather, who later became a friend with Salah ad-Din's grandfather, was a woodcutter who delivered wood to many big houses in the area. He was as big as a giant, and his ability with the axe was known in all the nearby villages. He could fell a tree faster than anyone else in that part of the world. Note the connection of tree with the physical power, which can be spotted in many areas of this novel, even when the context was not directly related to trees like the aforementioned one. Listen to the following old story narrated to the scribe by Shadi to record Salah ad-Din's first love as a teenager. The river is surrounded by a large grove of poplar trees in the distance. I could see him galloping ahead, his head uncovered and without any protection. I saw him rein in his horse and dismount. I did the same and tied my horse to a tree. Then I walked toward the boy. Soon I had found a suitable position behind some bushes, and there I could observe him quite clearly without being seen in return. In this specific account, trees were presented in a similar context, but were rather related to sexual power. The trees here were the witnesses of Salah ad-Din's libidinal strength. Elsewhere, Salah ad-Din narrated an interesting story about his youth to the author of his biography. It happened one day when the young Salah ad-Din went on some political mission with his uncle Sherko, meaning the mountain lion, from Damascus to Cairo on the aim of taking the power from the Fatimi Caliph. References linking trees to power appeared clearly in the scene in which Salah ad-Din and his uncle were on their way to challenge and undermine the Caliph's power. However, shortly before they arrived to the Caliph, they were faced by the Wazir who caught, fell on the floor, and kissed Sharuk's feet. He led us to the Caliph's palace through vaulted hallways and an endless number of ornamented chambers, each of them empty. Brightly colored birds from Africa were making a terrible noise. We passed through a garden which contained tame lion cups, a bear, and two black panthers tied to a tree. Sheruk was unmoved by all this, yet it was difficult not to be impressed. I tried to mimic my uncle and pretended that I too was unaffected. Unquote. In this context, the tree was portrayed with the elements of sovereignty and power emphasized. In the 10th and 11th chapters, there are some relevant sexual use of trees, but due to their obscenity, I don't want to dwell on them in details. But in such areas, we see the connection between sexual power and a tree, vice versa. In this context, I will only refer to this one, which I don't think I need to discuss. I mean, my point is clear. However, elsewhere, the context in which the tree was mentioned happened to refer to the power of memory. Quote, he, the famous scholar Imad al-Din, could recall not only the time of day or night when a particular incident had taken place, but all the circumstances as well. Once the Sultan had asked him how he could remember so much. He explained that his method was first to recall details such as the tree under whose shade the listeners were resting when the story was told, or the boat trip they were taking, the seashore, and the time of the day. Then everything would become clear. Unquote. So, as you can see, the tree appeared again here in a context of power. Um, The therapeutic and power given dimension of trees was emphasized again. For example, in a letter written by Jamila, another woman belonging to the Haram, to the scribe, explaining her sudden escape from Damascus and describing the pain that she went through after a failed love story. She described how she needed to go home to gain power from her place of origin. She wrote as follows: I want to smell once again the fragrance of the blossoms in the unique garden created by my grandfather, surrounded by the most beautiful wall that I have ever seen, a wall out of which grow the most lovely plants and flowers. I always used to think that heaven would be like our garden. Here I used to spend many hours in the silence among the trees, watching the birds coming down from the wall to drink water from a stream that had been contrived to create the impression that it was natural. End of the quote. So she even said that she imagined that one can, quote, cure the pain of the present by reliving one's childhood and youth, unquote. In this sense, trees are depicted as a kind of cure to the mind. In other words, the healing power of trees had some physical results, as far as this character's discourse seems to suggest. Such power-giving presentation of trees appeared again in the scribe's narrative after he was able to get over the tragic death of his family and after he went back to his original place. He said, the senses of lose was still present in me, but the pain had gone. I sent a letter to Ahmad ad-Din asking him whether I could rejoin the Sultan. 4 weeks later, as spring came to Cairo like a burst of soft laughter, a messenger arrived from Damascus. The Sultan ordered me to return to his side without further delay. I was sitting in the courtyard enjoying the sun underneath a gnarled tree with twisted twigs. It remained the same through all the seasons, and I had become greatly attached to it because it reminded me of myself. I too did not feel the delights of spring. This power provider tree became obvious in Salah ad-Din's own words when he talked about the sudden death of some of his men while he was apparently saved by a tree. Quote, we buried 4 emirs in this village only a week ago. I think I have survived simply by dint of sucking the juice of the lemons which hang from the tree outside. I cannot think of any other reason, for I was as ill as those who died. Unquote. Uh, in fact, in other place, the author told us that he was teaching one of his guards, the Sultan's guards, the basic moves of chess here underneath the lemon trees. Thus, trees in this novel inspired physical as well as intellectual powers. Even the figures of speech employed in this novel also linked tree to power. A good example was when a reference made about one strong intellectual who apparently from his early childhood was caught as well preserved and as a solid as ebony, unquote. At one point, the scribe tried to empower Salah ad-Din's son by explaining to him why his father didn't want him to take part in battles. A sibling, a sibling has to be protected from hot wind so that it too can grow and bear fruit. Uh, in some unobscene scene, the sexual organ of the haram's eunuch was assimilated to dateless palm tree. And to assert the pattern of power in the tree imagery seen in this novel, we are told that the aforementioned eunuch was able to be sexually, quote, drowned by pleasure, unquote, even though the narrator had already mentioned the state of his dateless tree. Sorry to mention this indecent detail, but I had to. Otherwise, some readers may think that this specific quote in the novel refutes my hypothesis. Um, Indeed, the tree imagery always produced power whenever it appeared in this novel. Listen to the scribe's next description regarding a specific stage of their journey from Cairo. Quote, once we had abandoned the green fields and rivers outside Damascus, the trees become fewer and fewer. My mood began to get correspondingly worse. End of the quote. The desert-like area with no trees around seems to suck the entire scribe's energy. In a sharp contrast to the previous examples, the separation from trees produce physical and intellectual weakness. Even the wood tower, which was built based on the archetype of a tree model, so to speak, was also used to inspire strength. Shortly before Salah ad-Din's decisive battle, the scribe noted the following. The next minute, the Sultan himself, to my amazement, clambered up on a newly constructed siege tower to test its solidity. I was alarmed at the needless risk, but young Al-Afdal, who stood by my side watching his father, laughed away my worries. We are used to him behaving like this before a battle. He insists on taking risks. He says it inspires confidence in the men. If the Sultan can die, then so can they. Um, in this novel, as long as there was a theme of power, there would probably be a tree or trees nearby. For example, we are told that the commander's tent had been pitched in the fragrant shade of orange trees. Um, After the Battle of Hattin, Salah ad-Din was still worried that the French would regroup and rally outside the walls of Jerusalem, and he embarked on a careful plan. A great sweep along the coast would destroy every French garrison. Then the holy city would fall into his lap like a ripe plum from a tree that is gently shaken. And again, elsewhere, Salah ad-Din explained to his to his leaders, why he postponed invading Al-Quds as follows. We will divide our forces and take all the towns on the coast. As you know, I am never happy when our army is divided and when emirs divide to lead squadrons in different battles. But that is what we are going to do before we reach Al-Quds. I want to shake the tree so hard that every orange lies on the ground except one. That one will pluck as if it were a rare and precious flower. Let us clear the coast of these infidels. End of the quote. Note the connection between trees and power in the following context. Um, um, Salah ad-Din declared to his army that the lands of the French were covered in forest of trees, but Allah will show them the strength of the sun. At specific moments, the scribe himself was empowered by trees. He said, I will remember that evening as we set up camp in the midst of orange groves and wild flowers. Their scent overpowers me even as I recall that night. There were dark clouds in the sky as Salah ad-Din walked up and down the camp. He spoke to nobody. Occasionally, he would pluck an orange from the tree, peel the skin, and consume the fruit. The sound of distant thunder distracted him. As he looked up, the rain began to fall. Actually, tree was not only related to power, but also to every positive and beautiful thing. For instance, Salah ad-Din told his scribe about his old days when he fell in love, and when he caught, he began to write poetry underneath the thick Forkin pear tree in the courtyard of Ayub's house. Unquote. Salah ad-Din had already narrated to his scribe about his glories and heroic young days with his companions at their well-known place. That's to say, the lake which was caught hidden by a clump of trees. Unquote. I would say that uh, the tree in this novel was always linked with power, except once in the second chapter, which of course undermines this highlighted pattern. In short, compared to the first novel of the Quantity of Islam, in which the tree was often linked to history, the symbolism of the tree in this second novel acquired a dimension apparently related to power, because unlike the first novel, which is related to the downfall of Muslims in Andalusia, the setting and event of this one pertains to the rise of Muslims elsewhere. Um, the third novel of the Islam Quanted opens in a palace that was used many years ago by the narrator's great grandfather, who had been exiled to this distant place by order of the Sultan at the time. In the description uh, of this palace, we are told that an army of apricot, walnut, and almond trees was planted to guard to guard his the narrator's great grandfather exile and shield the house from the storms that mark the advent of winter. So, unlike the first two novels discussed earlier, in this novel, a tree appears less, and even when there is a reference to trees, the context often had an odor of melancholy and loneliness. However, regarding these trees of the palace, which the narrator nostalgically remembered, listen to what she said. Every summer, for as long as I can remember, we had played in their shade, played and laughed and cursed and made each other cry, as children often do when they are alone. The trees in this novel belong to some golden past which is definitely irretrievable. In fact, references to trees in this novel are often covered with negative experiences. The narrator, whose name is Nilufar, recounted how she fell in love with some man many years ago and how her mother refused that person who she claimed belonged to different social strata. The narrator said the attitude was uncharacteristic of her. She was never bothered by family trees. It was simply that she had another suitor in mind. As I said earlier, this novel covers the last years of the Ottoman Empire. So, in an age where everything is crumbling, even the idea of family tree becomes meaningless. We have seen the importance of pedigree in the first novel, but here the tree in its full implications just means nothing. The connection between the past and the present was cut since the stagnant giant empire itself was about to be replaced by a new regime. In this sense, the tree that the founding father Othman once saw in his dream, which predicted the future of the great empire, became irrelevant. Or we could say that the same tree which once inspired great successes now cast a shadow that inspires melancholy. By the way, the title, The Stone Woman, refers to a statue in the garden of this decaying Ottoman villa, around which much of the noble's action takes place. In this sense, the Stone Woman statue is both a literal and symbolic figure. It is silent yet ever present, serving as a witness to the unfolding events, family secrets, and personal confessions of the characters. The statue of this pagan goddess was pivotal, since many members of the family and even the servant used to confess to it during the various changing ages. On the one hand, it reflects the lack of fruitful communication between people caused by the political background where people were unable to honestly talk about the truth of the current situation. So, unlike the beginning of the shadows of the pomegranate tree, where a woman talked with a tree, or even in the Book of Saladin, where people received power from trees, in this novel, a tree lost its healing power. Consequently, the family members paid all their attention to this stone woman. Likewise, trees were used to implicitly highlight the sun-setting era of the Ottoman Empire. Listen to this relevant description. The old magnolia trees with their large leaves were glistening in the dying rays of the sun. Trees uh, trees here seem to be inseparably connected to separation in the deepest memories of the narrator. In one place, she said, I left the house and walked through the orchard, the familiar smell of thyme and the pepper tree, reviving many old memories. The stone woman was still there, and I found myself whispering to her. In other words, trees here brought back nostalgic past which can never be retrieved. The narrator of the event was among the other members of the family who came from different parts of the empire to what can be considered as a reunion. In her daydreaming about their past, the narrator told us a story of her brother Salman, who was unjustly hated by their father because his mom died as she gave him birth. One day, he made some stupid remark that caused him to be beaten by his father. The narrator described the next sad moment which took place afterwards. The four brothers and sisters left the house caught as as if in a delirium. We walked to a flat rock not far below where the stone woman stood, hidden from us by a grove of pine trees. Unquote. As you could see, trees here appear again in a very melancholic context, witnessing that painful memory. Actually, what strengthens this established pattern is the fact that the aforementioned context included many bleak words such as violence, the explosion of a frustrated bitterness, a twisted face with heavy and coarse features, and delirium. Um, by the way, I am trying to follow the three references chronologically, the way they appeared in the novel. In general, I try to do this. Anyway, the real thread between past and present apparently became so absurd when we hear that people were superficially able to change their past. And that can be seen in the account about Mahmud Pasha, who manufactured untruths because he intended to marry a niece of the Sultan and thought it prudent to improve his pedigree. Thus, he claimed that he belonged to a pure Arab family descended from the tribe of the Prophet. Another symbolic deformation of tree imagery and its ramifications can be seen in the relevant sexual metaphors, which were very different from the positive ones appeared in and already highlighted in Shadows of the Pomegranate Tree. In this novel, a maidservant for the family confessed her story to the stone woman regarding the man of the house's evil tendency towards her. My worst fear was that one day the Pasha would put his poisonous seed in me and it would sprout. In chapter 5, there are sexual and obscene stories suggesting that the line of descent of people in power might have been decisively broken. This was another melancholic attack on the credibility of a pedigree, which was tackled in a total opposite manner in the first as well the second novel of the Islamic Wanted. The bleak and sick implications of the tree were noticed elsewhere. When Nilufar's mother Sarah was confessing to her about her old relation with Nilufar's true father, Salman, she Suleiman, she dwelt on the issue that her parents also refused that marriage. Her father, Kot, spoke of a mysterious disease that had developed in Suleiman's branch of the family after centuries of intermarriages. Since my mother belonged to that family, there was a serious danger that our children would be born with severe deformities and applications and die young. When he returned, it was with another bound volume. This contained our family tree. He showed us that the great grandmothers of my mother and Suleiman's mother had been sisters. The link was too far strong to take any risk. Unquote. In this melancholic context, the corruption penetrated to the very core of many different aspects of tree symbolism, so to speak, and that undoubtedly was not a coincidence. It rather reflected the cultural as well as the political background of the novel. Consequently, the tree was employed in these last quoted sentences to show that the fruit of Sarah and Suleiman's marriage would be a diseased child. Even even Solomon himself was shocked by the news. Quote, the sight of the family tree had shaken him. He described his cousin's death that uh, he described his cousin's death at the age of 7. He did not wish our child to die in that fashion. Unquote. Again, I have to remind you that I'm not following a linear path of events or delving into the details of these characters and events. Rather, the point is to simply highlight the relevant context in which trees are portrayed. We can look at another example where the tree is seen in a gloomy context, talking about some important day for the family. The narrator, that's to say, Nilufer, said it was a languid morning. There was no breeze and the sun was hot. We were sitting under the shade of a walnut tree on the front terrace. Without going into details of this description, its melancholic aspect is clear. In another place, the tree was used to express death, namely when we are told by the barber about the death of Salman's mother's Zakiya, not the melancholic description. After her death, his wife, I observed Iskandar's Pasha's entire character undergo a complete change. He was devastated. He reminded me of a tree struck by lightning. A tree has no option but to die. You see, here we feel the melancholy in its most intense form. Again, we see another corrupted employment of the tree metaphor. Nilufar's mother told her about her husband's longing for his first dead wife. He told me he could never love again. Charred wood, he used to say, can never be relit. So, tree in all its dimensions was completely destroyed and became as black as coal, so to speak. Even when trees were indirectly referred to in the narrative, they still had the aspect of old age and decay. For instance, in depicting the facial features of the family Berber, when he was telling some historical facts about the family to Nilufar, she used the following phrase: "The old man stroked the forest of white stubble that covered his chin." In this manner, tree, even as figures of speech, had negatively metamorphosed into a dried forest. In the same manner, the literary references to roots were repeatedly dysfunctional. When Nilufar's mother was telling her about her old lover who ran away after impregnating her, she said, but all this proves is that the root of his love did not go very deep. In this sense, the tree in all its parts seemed to wither in each part of this novel. It is as if the archetype of the tree has been damaged, which reflects the general atmosphere of decay and destruction. As was highlighted earlier, in the development of the novel's event, some characters discovered later that they had different fathers from the one that they used to know. Likewise, various references were exaggeratedly used to refer to the non-pure lineage, which was opposite of the pure pedigree emphasized in the first novel, where we were even provided with a family tree tracing back the memories the member's great father. Niloufer's brother, Salman, was accused by his own childless wife, Maryam, that it was his seed that is defective, and that she therefore should find another man. In fact, the symbolic corruption of trees surpassed the tree itself to reach even the person whose work involved trees. For example, unlike the carpenter in the shadows of the pomegranate tree, who was presented from the beginning of the novel as a hero and an honest person whose handmade chess challenged and likewise ridiculed the representation of the Inquisition, and whose artwork symbolically dominated many parts of the novel until its final scene. Unlike him, the carpenter in this novel was a cheating, dishonest traitor who betrayed Salman's trust and secretly had impregnated his wife while he worked in this house. in this house. The chaos of feelings as well as the futility continued. Salman added the following: My love for her was so strong that even at this stage I was prepared to forgive her. It was, after all, my seed that had failed to sprout. Uh, Another disturbing aspect can be seen in one bad person's behavior. He deflowered his own 17-year-old daughter. Therefore, he was assassinated and then his organ was cut. So, with the political downfall, people's ethics head toward self-destruction. The specific organ, which was repeatedly assimilated to tree in the first novel, since its important role in continuing the lineage, had changed here or actually deformed. Elsewhere, some character said the following about her husband: I had to lie down and let him put his little stick into me, but stone woman, I promise you, there was no enjoyment in this for me. End of the quote. Again, this organ, which was assimilated to a tree in the first novel, was reduced to a stick here. I apologize for the graphic details, but they are relevant to the established hypothesis. However, a change of perspective to catch up with modernity seems to be suggested at the end of the novel. That is why, when our narrator, Niloufar, later decided again to marry her new lover, who belonged to much lower social order, nobody of her family rejected the idea. She said, um, I was puzzled as to why none of them had objected to Salim's pedigree. 10 years ago, edicts would have been issued. The marriage took place within hours, without even calling on the sheikh to play his religious part. In fact, a few paragraphs later, uh, we realized that some family members had already decided to take a positive part in changing the old political system. So this change in social matters was the other face of the coin to the political one. Therefore, only after the changing the mindset of the family members that the implication of the tree started to recover. Um, After Niloufar met the guys who decided to take a role in modernizing the country, she narrated the following: I had been so taken with the morning that I had not noticed Uncle Mehmed comfortably seated on his favorite armchair underneath the walnut tree. He had been absorbed in a book and had initially frowned at the disturbance created by my laughter. This is the first context in which tree was mentioned by name with a positive implication, which of course reflects the decision of modernizing the mindsets of the inhabitants. So, as we have seen in the first novel, there was a kind of duality in the meaning of the tree symbolism in relation to past and present. And while the change here takes place in relation to the time before and after the modernizing the country, in shadows of the pomegranate tree, this change of the tree symbolism was changed in relation to the time before and after the destruction. Indeed, the eventual positive change in tree implications can be noticed even in the funeral procedure of the family Berber. As discussed, this positive role only took place after the entire narrative changed from bleak and stagnant perspective into a more changeable modern one. Note the nice description here. Quote, Hassan Baba had asked to be buried just before the sunset. Everyone from our household, man and woman, master and servant, was present when his body was lowered into the freshly dug grave. The earth was moist, and the scent of the wildflowers and trees would have pleased him. And as he wished, he was buried in a kind of Sufi celebration and or uh, ceremony where even his son sang for him. So the change of the tree symbolism in this part of the novel can be reversely compared to that seen at the massacre aftermath of the first novel, where the symbolism of the tree was covered in blood, so to speak. In other words, the symbolism of the tree became distorted after the significant event in the first novel, while it was restored in this novel following that turning point. The novel concludes with the narrator sitting in the garden, enjoying the pleasant weather as the new sun rises. She shares that she is expecting a child with her new husband, which probably symbolizes the emergence of a new mindset and culture set to replace the remnant of the old one. Three is significant in this work as well, that even the cover of the novel itself has a big uh, palm tree on it. This fourth novel of the Islamic Wanted deals with the life of the famous Muslim geographer Idrisi, who, like his other Muslim fellow citizens, lived in Sicily during the time of the Norman King Roger. Even though the Muslims become minority in Sicily at these critical times, their culture, science, and language were still dominant in the place. The pattern of tree imagery spotted in this novel was connected to a retrievable nostalgic past. In this sense, it was somewhat familiar um to the first novel. In this sense, it was somewhat similar to the first novel of the Islam Quanted, where the Muslim situation was shaky, but people tried to resist or rather hold on their knowledge and culture. The implication of the three were mostly similar due to the relative resemblances of both novels in terms of setting, people, and challenges. After all, what happened in Sicily and Andalusia had many things in common. That was why this novel was also filled of tree imagery connecting ones to their own history. And as Professor Louise Darsens noted, in focusing on Sicily's Norman Islamic culture, a sultan in Palermo also elaborates on the portrayal of Andalusia in Shadows of the Pomegranate Tree, depicting Sicily as a twin culture whose flourishing interfaith convivencia is nevertheless a fatally imperiled arrangement. End of the quote. However, at the beginnings of the novel, we are told that Idrisi slept more than usual, and in most of his dreams, he went back to his childhood, his mother looking at the stars, coupled street of Noto, the tree trunks scarred by lightning. As you can see, the focus on one's past was stressed in this novel as well. As a matter of fact, as the protagonist was further introduced to us, we are told that based on his age, he was compelled, quote, to think of the past, not the future, unquote. However, trees were mentioned again in relation to a nostalgic past when Idrisi talked about Homer's book in which he describes our seas and the islands and the countries and trees. Uh, as expected, the tree always find its significant place through the narrative. Likewise, the pivotal role of knowledge highlighted in the first novel was also emphasized here. For the scholar, The book had become the repository of all his emotions, and to provide more layers of meaning to the archetype of the tree, even the importance of pedigree was highlighted. Idrisi insisted that he was a direct descent from the family of the Prophet. A tree appears in the novel most critical event in order to provide an extra sense of story's connection to the Arabic heritage. For example, we are told about one of Idrisi's dreams. Quote, a recurring dream had disturbed his sleep for over a year. It was Sultan Rogeri, always in the same multicolored satin robe, lying half naked under a lemon tree weighted down with ripe fruit. Rogeri would stand, discard the robe, and attempt to seduce a tethered doe, unquote. The tree here represents the abundance of the area, yet the other content of the dream foreshadowed the king's later behavior of being forced to kick out Muslims and Jews from the place. From the place. Actually, another reason for the presence of trees in Idrisi's imagination was the fact that he was also a physician. We are told that he had carefully catalogued the plants and trees. So I'm just trying to show any quotation with the tree or any context in which trees were mentioned. Other aspects and parts of trees were also positively highlighted in this novel. For instance, when Idrisi came back to Palermo after spending long, intermittent periods selling coast to coast for writing down his book, which included the map of the world, he was thus welcomed. Prepare to receive the master Ibn Muhammad ibn Sharif al-Idrisi returned home from a long journey in search of the roots of knowledge. End of the quote. Elsewhere, a reference to palm trees was made in a context in which Idrisi was suddenly taken out of reality. And that is when he was in the middle of a sharp debate with his two daughters. As they kept quiet, he went in a daydreaming state of mind. The narrator said the following about Al-Idrisi. He liked the silence. He could hear the sea again and the gentle breeze that made the palms sway gently. For a moment, he forgot the presence of his daughters, but Samar's cold and now's resigned voice interrupted once again. End of the quote. A tree, as an aesthetic symbol of a past achievement, was recalled whenever Idrisi was surrounded with an ugly, unbearable situation. In this way, a tree was a part of the imaginary land toward which Idrisi often ran. Needless to say, that such employment of the trees were tackled similarly in the first novel. The typical direct relation between trees and books emphasized in Shadows of the Pomegranate Tree appears here again. When the King Roger spoke to Idrisi about one of his grandsons, he said, he was learning fast. You taught him, don't you remember? He was a healthy sapling, then shut up quickly like a young tree. I loved him, Idrisi. I tended him carefully. He was the pride of my orchard. In this way, the novel cleverly uh, and implicitly shows that Roger was one of the few people in the place who recognized that Muslim intellectuals were, in fact, cultivating a civilization there. The aforementioned connection was established again when Idrisi answered Roger's question regarding why Arabs didn't arrive to England. Idrisi said, in Al-Andalus and Siqliya, we could still smell the desert and grow our dates and lemons and pomegranates. But in England, the cold would have killed the palms and those who carried the seeds. We have we would have shone the light of learning on them. End of quote. In other words, for Muslims, without the existence of such trees, it would have been impossible for them to create a civilization. Hence, trees are the very cornerstones of their heritage. At one point, Idrisi reflected on the possibility that his sexual power might have decreased, but when he remembered the newly received news about his being the father of Eleanor, that simply got changed that simply changed everything. It was like catching a sight of a rich and fertile coast with a pure sand beaches, the color of gold and green mist rising from the rich forest of palms that lay behind. Unquote. Hence, this thought, which was, as you can see, contains within it a mention of palm trees, made him get out of his sad mood. Indeed, the best explanatory discussion regarding the significance of the trees to Muslims was well demonstrated by the rebellious character Philippe, as he answered the king's question about the pattern of the cities founded by Muslims, which they all were connected to water gardens and rows of straight trees. Philip replied as follows: The garden is heaven on earth. The water must be kept pure and clear in canals. The trees must be planted in rows. The reason is simple. It helps us develop pure and clear conceptions and guard against false illusions. The builders create cities like this everywhere to stress the universality of the Prophet's faith, and it is this that pushes the soldier of the Prophet towards expansion and the enemies of this faith towards surrender. End of quote. Elsewhere, in some interesting metaphor referring to some barons and bishops around the king who were planning to get rid of the Muslims and Jewish minorities and other minorities, their eyes were on the most beloved Philip. They wanted to get him caught, burned like a piece of wood, and his ashes scattered in the sea. Unquote. They were particularly aiming at that person for his well-known impact on people. They thought as follows: what would be the point of breaking a branch while the tree survives? End of quote. Thus, the tree, as a positive symbol that might retrieve the past, must be turned into a raven black dust. The richness of this symbol is further illustrated in another aesthetic description, namely in the militarily secretive gathering when the Emir introduced Idrisi to the fighting men who, like carefully planted trees, stood in a straight line. As soon as the setting moved away from the Muslim inhabited lands, we began to sense that even the aesthetic element of trees had changed during a trip with his son-in-law. Idrisi passed through a wasteland where quote, the dry, still and lifeless, the half-naked boughs on the stunted trees with their parched, withered leaf were all that remained of the spring. the sun glistening on the rocks. End of the quote. It is not surprising that while they were still riding across this place, Idris started daydreaming about some enchanted island that he arguably had once visited. The memory took him towards many details, including some obscene scene in which he and his crew attended a ceremony prepared by the island women who worshipped idols. We are told in a celebrated manner about that meeting. The men were given love pipes to smoke, then quote, jugs of red wine were placed on their table underneath the tree, unquote. Presently, different kind of food brought were brought, and the travelers ate as if they were starving. The important part in this reverie was that Idrisi used his imagination to revisit that enjoyable memory which took place beneath a tree while he was actually walking in a kind of deserted place. Three implications in the background, so to speak, always changed in accordance with the setting of the event. For example, the next description was mentioned when Idrisi was heading towards some meeting in which people were discussing the consequences of the close death of the Muslim-loving King Roger. There was no doubt that the people around the king would soon kick out Muslims and other minorities from the area. Thus, Muslims were preparing for some rebellious solution. There is no surprise that in such context, the trees foreshadowed the future event perfectly. However, while Idrisi was caught coming to a grove of trees, the trunks and boughs twisted by the wind and wounded by lightning, and the leaves parched and withered. He relented as he strolled among the trees. He could hear the men talk of the trusted one. Unquote. Elsewhere, with the mutinies already started taking place, the deformed implications of tree began to be manifested in the background. The bodies of the killed enemies were caught, hung, hung naked from trees. Unquote. As we have seen in the other novels, there is a duality in the symbolism of the trees, which shifts based on the unfolding fateful event. Elsewhere, the narrator wanted to show the supreme respect Muslims express towards their tree. He referred to the transcendental fragrance of different fruit trees that beautify Circusa, caught on the hills outside the city. The age-old, laboriously cultivated plantations of olive trees are being carefully inspected for the damage caused by the winter storms and lightning. Unquote. Also, after Idrisi went back home on the outskirts of Noto, after a long absence, we are provided with the description of his large house, which stood at the top of a hill. Quote, it was built on two levels around the courtyard bordered by a row of orange trees. Unquote. This deliberate reference to the existed trees had its impact on many characters. For instance, Idris is mentally ill child of man who always liked to be alone, and he spoke with animals. When someone approached him, he went to hide behind a tree, caught, and imagined that nobody could see him. Unquote. Hence, like father, like son, a tree was a kind of escape to the child. But in the child's world, it functioned in its physical dimension rather than imaginary one. It was until the final part of the novel that Idrisi met his mentally disturbed son, and it was only later when we come to realize that the child disease was resulted by the Roman Crusaders' persecution of Muslims inhabitant inhabitants. And as the child told Idrisi about his fears that the enemy would come and kill him, but he then promised that he would defy them if they do. And then he sat down on the chair beneath the tree, unquote. In this manner, the tree became not only a symbol of one's identity, but also a slogan of one's rebellion as well as history. Um, as Idrisi took his sick son um, on a walk, got to breathe the air and inspect the fruit trees, Othman proved himself knowledgeable here as well, looking closely at each tree and estimating the fruit it would bear later in that year. Unquote. Thus, the child who had lost a significant part of his brain or his memory due to a tragic trauma remained familiar with the importance of trees. This further emphasizes the portrayal of trees in connection to one's history. Soon afterward, Othman was scared after hearing some distant, loud sound, thinking that the enemy had come to kill both him and his people. But then, fortunately, he realized that it was merely his sister who came. He said, I will go and sit under the tree. End of quote. As a gesture to give time for his sister and his father to talk freely. In this scene, a tree clearly represented a place of meditation and a sort of peace for the sick child. However, with such thoughtful sessions and with his being exposed to his father's books, he gradually started recovering his normal state of mind. As was mentioned earlier, the vital relation between books and trees noticed in Shadows of the Pomegranate Tree returned here clearly. Based on Eleanor's account, quote, Othman likes living in an enclosed world. Once I asked if he would visit Circusa, and he ran out of the room and went to his tree. Once he told me that if there had been no library in the house, he would have died. And he meant every word of it. Unquote. So his enclosed world was to feel held under the leaves of the tree as well as the leaves of a book. In this manner, trees and books became essential alternatives for humans. Uh, Even though Othman later got better, the horrifying idea of leaving his place would always cause him to be panic, especially after the Palermo massacre, when Balkis suggested that Othman should leave with his father to Venice. He ran to his tree and he stayed there. Soon later, when his father left, quote, Othman retreated to the tree once again. He did not like people leaving the state. Unquote. In short, for most characters in this novel, particularly the protagonist and his son, the tree represent a gateway to a non-physical world, one that may be accessed through knowledge. Uh, the fifth and last novel in the Islamic Wanted is Night of the Golden Butterfly. Before starting, I have to confess that studying this particular novel was quite difficult for me. It has many characters and frequently shift between the present and the past, sometimes going further back in time and shifting from one place to another. Additionally, I don't have enough background in the history of Pakistan and its neighboring areas, nor in their beautiful, rich culture. However, this novel opens with the narrator, Dara, telling us about an old friend, painter, named Plato, living in Pakistan, who had once made him a favor and now asked the narrator to repay the debt in the shape of writing a book about him. The narrator is a writer living in London, having promised to fulfill his promise in turning the story of Plato's life into a novel, was obliged to reconnect with the individuals and events of the past. One of the challenging tasks that he had to go through was to meet Jundia, a brilliant Chinese Pakistani woman who was nicknamed the Golden Butterfly, and with whom the narrator had fallen in love many and many years ago. Similarly, the narrator had to meet her husband Zahid, once an old dear friend to the narrator. So, our narrator Dara had his own reasons to hate Zahid and to cut his relation with him all these years, thinking that he was a traitor. But he ultimately found himself accepting to meet with Zahid and his wife after non-existent communication that lasted for about half a century. Interestingly, unlike in the previous four novels, the colorful image of the tree somewhat lost its positive implications in this novel, which takes place in various areas of the modern era. Here, with the presence of colonial power, the tree often becomes a symbol shifting between order and chaos. Having said that, we still find here common issues tackled in the previous four novels. For example, when the narrator tells us about Zahid's past, he says that he belonged to a wealthy Punjabi family, yet his ancestors were peasants descended from low-caste Hindus whose job it was to grow vegetables for the rulers of the city. Thus, Zahid found his parents' abstention of his plan to marry Jundia, who apparently belonged to a low social order, meaningless. However, when Dara finally paid a visit to them after all these years of no contact, as a part of reviving old memories to fulfill his promise of writing the novel, he entered their fancy house in London. He said, while Zahid went to get some drinks just to be difficult, I asked for fresh pomegranate juice. End of quote. This subtle reference to the title of the first novel implies that in this final novel of the Quented, we are in one way or another dealing with the fruits of or results of the past event. At any rate, even though most of the characters in the novel by now were away from their homeland, and even though we are told that things in their homeland were terrible, still they seemed to hold on to their past. As for Zahid's library, the narrator tells us during his visit to their house in London that the large oak paneled study was certainly impressive. The couple now lives in postmodern world, yet they still seem to want to connect with nature. Um, Thus, employing figures of speech related to trees is also seen in this novel. After Dara ate his old lover's food, he said, "My stomach had been completely won over, but the path to my heart was still blocked by a forest of stinging nettles." End of quote. By which he implicitly referred to his yet to express reproach to the couple. Um, the idea of Muslims' current painful situation being somehow the result of the past mistakes was implied by referring to characters and events belonging to previous novels as well as to fruit juices. For instance, later when the narrator takes us to his young old days in Lahore, he mentioned his intellectual rebellious meetings with Plato, which used to take place in some juice bar, where a mixed pomegranate and orange juice was often served. In describing the place in which their intellectual meetings were held, the narrator informs us that he used to spend most of his time caught at our table in the corner underneath a big peepal tree with its 8 places permanently reserved for us. Unquote. Not to forget that the tree existence of this specific type of tree, not to forget that existence of this specific type of tree was relevant to the character's culture. The sacred people tree underneath which Buddha attained enlightenment was used here apparently to provide a sense of being enlightened by knowledge. Additionally, this specific tree also reflects the background event that took place in India during the partition. This tree is considered highly holy by the three major religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism. In a similar way, that this tree is the state tree of the Indian states of Odisha and Haryana. So a tree here was probably employed to establish a sense of unity and order against the imperial chaotic tendency of division. Note that this tree particularly has a long lifespan. In Bhagavad Gita, Krishna said, "I am the people tree among the trees." So the tree in such significant place was a call, so to speak, for national unity. Be that as it may, it was under that tree that the narrator and his friends in the past days began to know about their strange friend Plato's tragic past before he came to Lahore. They discovered more about his childhood, such as he was originally named Muhammad Aflatun. Likewise, they realized that Plato's family, along with many other Muslims from their village in East Punjab, was burned in the infamous event of 1947. Therefore, he ran away from the partitioned subcontinent to the other side. The terrible partition caused much damage to the people, and thus it was always criticized in this novel. Um, Furthermore, one of the narrator's old friend of the old friend at that time, who was also a member in their meetings, was Hanif, aka Confucius. The narrator elaborated on the first time he visited his friend's house and how he instantaneously fell in love with his friend's sister, Jundia. It was in that house and in that day that they told him about a family trip which he could join. The narrator takes us to that old trip he made with his friend's family. In the narrator's portrayal of the landscape of the place of the trip, which seems to belong to an enchanted past of his country. He said, um, quote, beyond Mori lay the rough road to the Gallis, the valleys between the Himalayan foothills clothed in pines. Soon after leaving the hill station, the fragrance of these trees became overpowering. More than 100 years ago, the British had come to the Gallis and built hill cottages with quaint names like Crickstone, Monry Rising, Retreat, etc., to remind them home. End of quote. And because the narrative is somewhat related to colonial age, hence such a focus on this specific type of tree was used, which is also linked to the British sense of order. Uh, so in that trip, they stayed in the Pine Hotel. The narrator Dara tells us about a girl that he knew who had some problems with her sweetheart. Quote, a few days before Layaluma left Nathaya Gully, I found her on her own, seated underneath a chestnut tree not far from Pine's Hotel. I hinted that a friend of mine in Peshawar had informed me of her dilemma. She was stunned. And end of quote. He gave her some advice that would later do the trick and settle up things for her. But the appearance of a tree in such a chaotic situation is interesting. I wanted just to refer to that. Uh, Elsewhere, the narrator goes back to one of his past secretive meetings with Jundia, which he described as follows. As we walked past the tree to which was attached the Nairan college bell, that evil toxin which summoned the women to class and assemblies and signaled that visitors should leave, I took out my penknife and detached the bell from the rope. My escorts, three of them cousins of mine, were horror struck. End of quote. He instead put the bell in his own house, saying the following: the memento, rusty and worn like the college to which it once belonged, still hangs from the mango tree in my mother's old garden, where it was often used by the gardener to frighten away the parrots. The following week, Jundia and I met at the German cafe, and she confessed that the theft of the bell had cheered her a great deal, restoring me to her favor. Unquote. So the bell under the tree was used as a symbol of order, which was challenged by Dara. This rebellious act helped him win his sweetheart's admiration. Thus, these two connected scenes show the shift in the tree's symbolism, swaying between order and chaos. The trees were also presented in the most pivotal past occurrence in the novel. In the narrator's last desperate rendezvous with Judea before he left his country many years ago, he made up his mind that the tryst would take place at night in Ashelmar Gardens. But when his friend Plato told him that it was hard to have an access to the place at night, let alone to avoid being seen by the guardians, the narrator said the following: Plato had no idea that I had solved this one. Close family friends were the hereditary guardians of Shalimar. The reward for having tilled the soil and sown the seeds when the gardens a Mughal passion were being constructed. End of quote. In other words, the narrator's friends, forebears, were the ones who planted the trees, and therefore their inheritor had the right to give its access to his friend to enjoy the place now. This twist asserts the subtle theme in this novel, which employed trees in a sense of referring to the modern state as a fruit of what was planted by the old generations of Muslims in the different parts of the Islamic world. Furthermore, it confirmed the connection of trees with the theme of order and chaos. This significant scenes portrayed Dara as he challenged all orders and traditions. At any rate, during the aforementioned meeting with Jundia, amid the garden trees, Dara, the challenger of orders, was alone with her in the place and aware that he would soon leave the country, attempted to make love to her, which upset her. Consequently, she swore at him and left him with Plato, who was waiting outside to take her home by his car. Plato's participation in that dangerous adventure was the favor that he had done for the narrator in the past, which is why the latter agreed to repay him by writing a novel about him. Needless to say, the title of the novel referred to this night that I'm talking about. However, I just want to highlight that the idea of lineage was repeatedly emphasized in this novel as well, just like the other novels. For example, we are told that some inhabitants of Bichin, Kot, would never be happy tracing their lineage to the time of the Great Khan. They insist they are the direct descendants of the Arab traders and ambassadors who came to these shores while the Prophet, honor his name, was still alive. Unquote. Here, the narrator wanted to emphasize Muslims' civilizational impact on the places that they went to in the past. The famous Prophet saying was discussed: seek knowledge where you find it, even as far as China, in order to prove that the main goal of these ancestors when they arrived to that land was to seek knowledge, not profit. The tragic persecution of Muslims in China back then was also discussed in the novel, which was followed with the following disturbing adage. Quote, they say that the grass grows stronger on plains enriched with blood, but sometimes nothing will grow on that soil. End of quote. This blood-stained lesson referred to occasion when the idea of plantation and growing was unattainable. In the next years following the partition, decay started to further spread in the homeland. Even the taste of the place seemed to change after our narrator Dara left Rahur. Thus, soon later, Plato decided to leave as well. He explained the situation to Dara by justifying the reason for his departure. Quote, because things were changing. Life at our table died soon after you left. They were planning to demolish Babuji's cafe and respected the fruit, juice, parlor, and replaced them with something modern and ugly, unquote. In other words, the old nostalgic scenes with the national tree shading people become unfortunately outdated. The implication is that this was probably caused by the colonial power that succeeded in cutting the connection between the natives and their past, restricting their attempt to gain power from their own history. Instead, they were provided with modern life alternative that doesn't always correspond with their culture. Uh, else, uh, Elsewhere, The paradisiac tree was painted by Plato in a very earthy, obscene manner, with a fanatic doing a terrible, indecent thing while he gazed longing at the forbidden apple on the celestial tree. Needless to say that in this chaotic painting, Plato was challenging the order of the religious fanatics. I don't want to go in details about this, but I just wanted to refer to it. But it is very obscene description. At any rate, after leaving Lahore, Plato moved back to North London and bought a ground floor, a three-room flat in Kilburn. One of the rooms was huge and had French windows that opened into a garden with a crumbling wall and a few apple trees. And this became precious to Plato. He seemed happy whenever I saw him, but far from any illusions of being successful in the traditional sense and still prone to fits of melancholy that went so deep that it frightened me. He really had been carefree in Lahore. The past had been repressed in those early years. He never talked about it, but it had returned to haunt him in middle age. Unquote. In this context, trees became alternatives to Plato's friends and served as an antidote to the deformation that took place in his homeland. They inspired revolutionary artistic ideas and, above all, provided a sense of order in his life. The intended attack on trees was emphasized in different areas with Muslim populations, which shows the growing chaos in the area. In Jundia's diary, written in 1986, the narrator read that things were not the same anymore in Paki, Nathia Kali. Quote, uh, it is changed, overcrowded, each new ugly house intruding on another, no planning at all, depressing being here, and this is our first week. The place is full of eyesores, too much Logan has denuded the pine forest, unquote. In this way, the resultant chaos from the destruction of the native land in the postmodern world not only deformed trees as a symbol, but also removed them as a physical entity. In this process, native values were brutally uprooted. As was previously highlighted, trees often appeared in the context of challenging the laws and breaking the habits. For instance, when Zahid talked about his secret meeting with Anjum, a woman who was often beaten by her husband, he said, quote, I drove to Sahiwal. We met at a pre-arranged spot and I followed her car to some godforsaken place. A tiny stream and a few trees is all I can remember. We talked for a few hours, but she was not prepared to walk out on the drunkard who often assaulted her in and out of his cups. There were no children. I could not understand why she didn't leave him. Unquote. Based uh, on the description discussed, he almost forgot every physical aspect of that memory except for the trees, which were an inseparable part of the experience. In this sense, the trees were the only entity that connected him to the past, serving as a tool to revive old lost memories. And this scene also refers to a situation or a context where um, uh, rebel or yes, where rebel is involved, rebel against the traditions. Needless to say, partition did not merely create physical ugliness and halt progress. At a certain point, it infiltrated every aspect of people's lives, much like cancer. As a result, even the arts became deranged. In Plato's diary, we read the following quote: Malik, his pair, came to me with paintings because I refused to go to his neat, tidy studio that I have always hated. There, we used to crowd into the middle of the room, and he would light the place with five huge spotlights and display his paintings. Most of them were examples of bad landscape art, mountain streams with a deer watching from above, uh, pine trees and hills with monkeys, portraits of the famous and rich, and copies of countless other paintings that already existed. His admirers, and there were many, claimed that his finest work had been done in a pre-partition Lahore in 1940s, when the city was known as the Paris of the East. Unquote. The keynote or the key point to emphasize here is that the paintings created after the partition pale in the comparison to the old ones. This highlights the significant shift in the symbolism of trees following the political catastrophe as demonstrated in the previous novel. In other words, when examining the symbolism of the tree in these novels, we must consider the context specifically, whether it occurs before or after the novel's turning point. Uh, as the last novel, as the last novel in the Islamic Wanted, which began with Shadows of the Pomegranate Tree, this novel included many references to the product of trees. That's why from the very beginning until the end of the novel, we have many references to juices. For example, more than once, orange juice was served. Elsewhere, there was an insistence on having juice. For instance, when the friends were preparing for the reunion, which would take place in the now deceased Plato's gallery, having landed in the homeland with a helicopter, the narrator was taken to some cottage. He said, quote, I was greeted by a refrigerator overloaded with Mori beer, but demanded fresh lime juice without sugar and a jug of tamarind juice with ice and honey. We men showered, and then Zahid and Confucius knocked on my door. I offered them a beer. Both preferred the tamarind concoction, unquote. Shortly later, we are told the following. Zainab was forced to announce that Elise was indisposed and had retired early. I was sure that the rusty orange juice that none of us had touched had rooted her, uh, had rooted her insides, and the deadly desert diarrhea germ permanently in search of an opening had scored a majestic triumph. End of the quote. It is not surprising that the fruits were simply rotten. Plato's farewell paintings that he left to the world were interesting. In the final setting of the novel, the friends of the past were finally united in their motherland and surrounded as well as surprised by Plato's amazing paintings, which summarized, so to speak, the destruction of his of his homeland in particular and of the Muslims throughout the ages in general. After discussing after discussing and describing many paintings that historicize the painful destruction in this country, we are introduced to other paintings that generally address Muslim history. The topic of most of these paintings were tackled in the previous four novels. For instance, in some paintings we see Ataturk, Maimonides, Abu al-Ala al-Ma'arri, and the great scholars of Al-Andalus and the Muslim world, Ibn Hazm, Ibn Sina, and Ibn Rushd, and the Sicilian geographer Al-Idrisi, who in some painting was showing the world his maps of the world. Uh, Sorry, I feel tired, but I'm about to finish. Here is the final reference regarding a tree, which is so nostalgic as well as relevant. In Plato's third and last section of the triptych quote, there was the table in college cafe in Lahore, around which we were all grouped in the shadows of a people tree, unquote. In this sense, the end brought us back to the very beginning, that is to say, to the shadows of the pomegranate tree. This clever end suggests the importance of the tree, which was linked with history and knowledge, as was explained in detail by Far. As we have seen, the paradigm of tree in its full sense of the word was richly employed in the quantity of Islam. Even though a tree represents an important symbol to all Muslims, yet it has some different indication due to its connection to cultural heritage of people. For example, the way Arabs looked at the palm tree is different from the way Ottoman looked at the chinar tree, which is likewise different from the way an Indian looked at the people tree, and so on. This presentation explored the symbolism of trees from various perspectives to end up highlighting five general symbolic representations of the tree in each novel. Shadows of the Pomegranate Tree was so rich with the positive references to trees, since it is a vital part of the setting. That is to say, the trees were the signature that Arabs left in Andalusia. Hence, it was used as a link between the inhabitants and their history. However, the second novel, the Book of Saladin, which was the only novel in the quantity that examined an age and time where glory was accomplished by Muslims. So, no wonder that the tree in this specific novel was always linked to power. The third novel, however, The Stone Woman, took place at the last wintry period of the Ottoman Empire, whose melancholic shadow reigned on most tree references. The symbolism of the trees in the fourth novel, A Sultan in Palermo, was examined in a similar light as the first one, due to the common historical similarities of the two novels. Finally, the events of the last novel, Night of the Golden Butterfly, took place in the modern world, with many visit to post-partitioned India and Pakistan. This novel had many different settings as well as many changes from present to past, and sometimes it went deeper backwards. That's why the meaning of tree symbolism was changeable, but in many highlighted areas, it was linked to to the theme of order and chaos. This study attempted to explain the connection between these novels, which started with the pomegranate tree. Hence, it is not surprising that the final novel in the Islamic Wanted was subtly written to show that the offshoot, so to speak, of the tree found in the title of the first novel is the world in which we are living now. In short, Tariq Ali seems to propose that allowing one's history to go unstudied and permitting the voice of ignorance to drown out the voice of reason will yield nothing but rotten fruits. Here are the references for everything I mentioned and used in this study. I hope you liked my new analysis of this collection of novels. Thanks for listening.